History is not merely a collection of dates carved into cold stone. It is the heavy breath of those who stood at the edge of the abyss. It is the silent tears absorbed by the earth, and the quiet, defiant pulse of hearts that refused to stop beating when the world demanded their silence. There are chapters of human existence so profoundly harsh that they transcend the boundaries of ordinary endurance, entering a realm where flesh and bone are sustained entirely by the sheer unyielding force of spirit. Today, we journey across the vast expanse of time to the dark waters of the Arabian Sea. To a story born of African blood and forged on Indian shores, we go to a fortress wrapped in the suffocating embrace of the longest, most brutal siege imaginable. A place where starvation was a daily companion, where men and women gnawed on boiled leather just to see another sunrise, choosing the unimaginable agony of survival over the quiet relief of surrender. This is the testament of the Siddi warriors. This is the famine of Janjira. If this testament of human resilience speaks to your soul, if the forgotten chapters of our shared past ignite a fire within you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support keeps these untold stories alive. The journey begins. Before the walls of stone rose from the salt and spray of the ocean, there was a migration of souls. They came from the burning savannas and the dense, vibrant heart of Africa. The Siddis, a people of profound strength and deep ancestral pride, found themselves carried by the winds of trade and the cruel tides of fate across the Indian Ocean. They were merchants, sailors, and mercenaries, bringing with them a rhythmic heartbeat of a distant motherland. When their bare feet touched the shores of the Indian subcontinent, they did not arrive as conquerors, nor did they remain as mere captives of circumstance. They arrived with a quiet determination to carve a destiny out of the foreign soil. In a world fragmented by shifting empires and endless territorial ambitions, the Siddis understood a fundamental truth of survival. To exist in a land of wolves, one must build a sanctuary that the wolves cannot penetrate. They carried in their veins the resilience of continents, an unspoken understanding that freedom is rarely granted. It is meticulously built, stone by heavy stone. Their dark skin, gleaming under the scorching sun, became a symbol of martial prowess and unwavering loyalty along the continent coast. They were not just a diaspora, they were a storm gathering on the horizon, a people who looked at the vast, unpredictable ocean and saw not a barrier, but a fortress waiting to be claimed. It is here, in the synthesis of African resilience and maritime mastery, that the seed of an immortal legend was planted. Out of the churning waves, an architectural marvel began to breathe. Janjira was not just a fort, it was a defiant declaration of existence rising directly from the womb of the Arabian Sea. The Siddis did not build their home on the mainland, where armies could march and cavalry could charge. They chose an oval rock, entirely surrounded by the restless ocean, turning the treacherous waters into their first line of defense. Granites, black as the starless night, were hauled and stacked with a precision that mocked the destructive forces of nature. The walls soared 40 feet high, curving gracefully yet menacingly, equipped with rounded bastions that housed cannons capable of breathing fire in every direction. To look upon Janjira was to look upon a slumbering leviathan. It had no land bridge, no easy approach. To reach its towering gates, one had to brave the crashing surf. Fully exposed to the watchful eyes of the city archers and gunners, within these massive, unyielding walls, a community thrived. They dug deep into the bedrock, discovering freshwater wells, a miraculous gift of nature that made life sustainable in the middle of the salty expanse. Janjira became an impregnable jewel, a thriving microcosm of African culture deeply rooted in Indian waters. It was a place of safety, of booming trade, and of fierce independence. For decades, it stood as a silent guardian, a sanctuary that laughed at the shifting powers of the mainland. But no sanctuary goes unnoticed by the ambitious. The very impregnability of Janjira transformed it into a symbol of ultimate defiance, an unbearable thorn in the side of those who wished to rule the coast absolute. The fortress had been built to withstand the anger of the sea, but it was about to face a tempest of human making, a storm of iron, fire, and a hunger so profound it would test the very limits of the human soul. The mainland of the Indian subcontinent has always been a theater of sweeping conquests, a vast stage where empires rose like thunderstorms and shattered like glass. In the shadows of the Western Ghats, a new, formidable power was awakening, one that would cast a long, heavy silhouette over the sunlit waters of the Konkan coast. The Maratha Empire, fueled by a fierce desire for self-rule and territorial dominance, was expanding its reach with the inexorable force of a rising tide. Led by visionary kings and brilliant tacticians, the Marathas commanded legions of swift cavalry and unyielding infantry, swallowing forts and kingdoms with astonishing speed. Yet, every time their gaze turned toward the shimmering expanse of the Arabian Sea, their triumphant march was halted by a singular, defiant monolith. Janjira stood there, a dark pearl resting on a bed of blue, mocking the limits of their terrestrial might. To the Marathas, the city's stronghold was not merely a military obstacle. It was an ideological affront. How could a massive, sprawling empire, capable of bending the vast Indian landmass to its will, be thwarted by a solitary rock, garrisoned by men of African descent? The existence of Janjira challenged the very narrative of Maratha invincibility. It was a clash of two entirely different philosophies of existence. The expansive, land-hungry ambition of a rising dynasty against the concentrated, hyper-defensive survivalism of a diasporic people who had nowhere else to retreat. The Marathas poured their wealth and ingenuity into building a navy, a fleet designed specifically to crush the naval supremacy of the cities. They constructed their own sea forts, fortified the coastline, and prepared for a war of attrition. The shadow of the empire crept closer to the island, turning the once open waters into a chessboard of maritime hostility. The air around Janjira grew thick with the scent of impending ruin, as the mainland prepared to hurl the full, crushing weight of its military apparatus against the stone walls that housed the children of Africa. There comes the moment in the history of every great fortress when the theoretical threat of war materializes into the deafening reality of siege. For Janjira, this transition was marked not by a single chaotic battle, but by a chilling, deliberate orchestration of encirclement. The horizon, usually dotted with the familiar sails of merchant ships bringing spices and grain, darkened with the war banners of the Maratha armadas. Hundreds of vessels, bristling with cannons and armed men, formed a crescent of doom around the island. On the adjacent shores, artillery batteries were dragged through the mud and elevated onto strategic cliffs, their heavy iron muzzles pointing with lethal precision at the black granite of the city sanctuary. Within the fort, the alarm bells tolled, a frantic, rhythmic weeping that echoed through the narrow, crowded streets. It was the sound of a world shrinking. The massive, iron-studded wooden gates of Janjira, which had always been the welcoming mouth of a prosperous trade hub, groaned on their massive hinges. The physical effort required to push those towering doors shut was immense, but the psychological weight of the act was far heavier. When the heavy wooden beams fell into place, locking the gates from the inside, a profound and terrifying finality settled over the island. They were sealing themselves in. The closing of the doors was a declaration of ultimate defiance, but it was also the beginning of an unprecedented isolation. The first cannonball fired from the mainland tore through the salty air, a screaming herald of the agony to come. It struck the outer bastion with a concussive thud that vibrated through the very bedrock of the island, a physical shockwave that told every man, woman, and child inside that the time for diplomacy had died. The sky, once a canvas of peaceful sunsets, became a ceiling of fire and smoke. Janjira was no longer a thriving maritime capital. In the span of a single afternoon, it had been violently transformed into a locked survival bunker, a stone cage suspended between a hostile sky and a treacherous sea, where the only currency of value was the sheer will to outlast the storm. For a people born to the rhythms of the ocean, the sudden betrayal of the sea was a spiritual wound as much as a tactical disaster. The Siddis were master mariners. The Arabian Sea was their highway, their provider, their moat, and their escape route. They understood its currents, respected its moods, and had built their entire civilization upon its restless back. But as the Maratha blockade tightened, weaving a dense net of patrol boats and heavily armed galleys around the island, the ocean transformed from a benevolent mother into a cold, indifferent warden. The siege lines were drawn so tightly that not even a fishing skiff could slip through the watery perimeter without being spotted and blown to splinters. The sea, stretching out to the horizon in a mocking display of infinite space, became the very instrument of their asphyxiation. The Siddis would stand on the high parapets, the salty wind whipping against their faces, and stare out at the water that had once been their domain. They could see the mainland tantalizingly close, where fresh rivers flowed and fields swayed with crops. They could see the campfires of the enemy army burning like a necklace of hateful stars along the coast. The psychological torment of this visual proximity was unbearable. They were surrounded by water, yet completely severed from the world. Every attempt to smuggle in supplies under the cover of a moonless night ended in fire and blood on the waves. The Marathas understood that to break the stone walls of Janjira, they first had to break the umbilical cord that connected the island to the sea. The blockade was a slow, deliberate strangulation. The vast, beautiful ocean had become a watery grave for their ships, a shimmering barrier that kept salvation out and locked despair inside. The waves crashing against the fort's base no longer sounded like a comforting lullaby. They sounded like the ticking of a colossal, unforgiving clock, measuring the time they had left before the isolation consumed them entirely. As the months bled into years, the thunder of the cannons outside became secondary to the silent, creeping terror growing within the stone walls. The grand storehouses of Janjira, deeply excavated chambers that had once overflowed with mountains of millet, sacks of rice, dried fish, and fragrant spices, began to echo with a hollow, terrifying resonance. The logistics of survival under an absolute blockade are a brutal mathematical equation, one where the variables are human lives and the constant is an ever-diminishing pile of grain. The leaders of the city garrison were forced to become auditors of human sustenance, making agonizing calculations that would decide who would maintain their strength and who would slowly wither away. Rationing began as a cautious measure, a slight reduction in portions. But as the seasons changed and the Maratha ships refused to leave the horizon, the rations were violently slashed. The transition from abundance to anxiety is a profound psychological shift. The daily meal, once a moment of communal gathering and respite, became an exercise in desperate restraint. Mothers would scrape the bottoms of clay pots, disguising their own hunger to offer a few extra grains to their children. Warriors, whose broad shoulders and heavy musculature required immense energy to man the heavy cannons and patrol the walls, felt the slow, agonizing theft of their own strength. Starvation is not a sudden death. It is a thief that works in the shadows. It steals the fat, then it consumes the muscle, and finally it begins to gnaw at the mind. The physical act of sweeping the stone floors of the granary to recover single, stray grains of wheat became a ritual of sacred desperation. The people of Janjira were fighting a two-front war, one against the relentless bombardment of an empire that wanted to erase them from history, and another, far more intimate war against the biological imperative of their own bodies. An empty stomach is a loud, tyrannical master, constantly demanding attention, eroding focus, and whispering seductive thoughts of surrender. Yet, even as their cheeks hollowed and their eyes sank deep into their skulls, the fire of defiance within the Siddi people refused to be extinguished. They looked at the dwindling piles of food not as a countdown to their death, but as a measure of how much more they had to endure before they could prove to the world that their spirit was heavier than the empire's iron. Time, under the suffocating canopy of a prolonged siege, ceases to be a linear progression of days and nights. It morphs into a heavy, stagnant pool, a cruel dimension where every hour is stretched upon the rack of uncertainty. For the city defenders of Janjira, the initial adrenaline of warfare, the fiery defiance that accompanied the first clashes of iron and the roaring exchanges of artillery, slowly bled into a hollow, agonizing monotony. The Maratha commanders, recognizing that the stone leviathan could not be breached by force alone, settled into a strategy of psychological attrition. They understood that the mind fractures long before the walls crumble. There were days of deafening bombardment, where the sky rained fire and the island trembled. But these were often followed by weeks of an eerie, profound silence. This silence was not a reprieve. It was a weapon forged from pure dread. In the quiet, the defenders were left alone with the rhythmic crashing of the waves and the echoing void in their bellies. The anticipation of the next attack became a phantom that stalked the narrow corridors of the fort, whispering tales of inevitable doom. Sleep became a fragile luxury, constantly interrupted by the paranoid fear of a night raid or the groaning of a comrade succumbing to despair. The erosion of time wore down the sharp edges of their martial pride, replacing it with a grim, mechanical endurance. Children grew up knowing nothing but the shadow of the enemy fleet and the taste of fear, their laughter silenced by the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of a tomb that had not yet been sealed. The island was a pressure cooker of claustrophobia, where the same faces, the same stones, and the same terrifying horizon became a labyrinth from which there was no awakening. Yet, within this psychological crucible, a profound, almost terrifying communal bond was being forged. The shared suffering stripped away all superficial divisions, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth that they would either endure together as a monument to resilience, or perish together as a footnote in someone else's history. When the last dust of grain was swept from the stone floors and the final drops of grain, gruel was scraped from the communal pots, a new, unthinkable threshold of survival was breached. Hunger is a predatory beast. It does not simply ask to be fed. It demands to consume everything in its path, slowly turning the body into an engine that digests its own muscles and tissues. The Siddi warriors, men whose ancestors had hunted lions on the savannas and tamed the wild currents of the ocean, were now hunted by their own collapsing biology. As the agonizing cramps of starvation twisted their insides, they turned their desperate gaze upon the very instruments of their survival. They looked at the heavy leather shields that had deflected Maratha swords, the thick belts that held their scabbards, the saddles that had once graced their magnificent war horses. In the logic of a starving mind, these objects ceased to be armor and transformed into the last, desperate reservoirs of sustenance. The fires that once forged weapons were now used to boil tough, centuries-old animal hide. The process was a slow, grim ritual. The leather was hacked into strips, soaked into precious, diminishing pools of water, and boiled for hours, sometimes days, until it broke down into a gelatinous, foul-smelling paste. The taste was an abomination, a bitter, rancid cocktail of salt, sweat, and animal glue that gagged the throat and revolted the stomach, but they forced it down. Mothers chewed the softened leather until their jaws ached, passing the bitter pulp into the mouths of their weeping children. Warriors chewed on the remnants of their saddles as they stood watch, the rhythmic grinding of their teeth a silent testament to an unyielding will. To eat one's own armor is an act of profound, almost sacred defiance. It is a declaration that the flesh may wither, the stomach may rot, but the spirit refuses to concede defeat. The Marathas waited for the white flag of surrender, expecting the famine to break the African spirit, completely unaware that behind those black granite walls, the defenders were literally consuming their own defenses to buy another day of freedom. The physical toll of this grotesque diet, combined with the relentless, grinding stress of the siege, initiated a terrifying metamorphosis within the walls of Janjira. The majestic, broad-shouldered Siddi warriors, once renowned across the coast for their physical dominance and intimidating stature, were slowly reduced to moving phantoms, their dark skin, once gleaming with vitality, stretched tight over protruding ribcages and hollowed cheeks, taking on an ashen, spectral hue, their eyes sinking deep into their sockets, burned with a feverish, almost unnatural intensity. The last flickering coals of a fire that refused to die. When the Maratha scouts peered through their spyglasses hoping to see a broken, defeated garrison, they were met instead with a terrifying vision. They saw skeletal figures patrolling the high bastions, their movements slow, deliberate, and jerky, like reanimated corpses bound by an unbreakable oath. The sight of these emaciated guardians sent a chilling ripple of unease through the besieging army. How do you defeat an enemy who has already crossed the threshold of death but refuses to fall? How do you conquer a fortress guarded by men who have nothing left to lose but the very marrow in their bones? The Siddi warriors moved with a mechanical, spirit-driven determination. They loaded the heavy cannons with arms that trembled from exhaustion, their joints aching with every agonizing motion. Yet, when the order to fire was given, the cannons roared with the same lethal precision as they had on the first day of the siege. These moving phantoms became the ultimate psychological weapon against the Maratha. They stood on the walls, not just as defenders, but as terrifying monuments to human endurance, silently communicating across the water that the Maratha Empire could starve their body, but it could never, ever reach their souls. Surrounding this theater of starvation was the ultimate, cosmic cruelty, an infinite expanse of water. The Arabian Sea stretched out in every direction, a vast, shimmering blue mirror that reflected the scorching sun by day and the cold stars by night. To be dying of thirst and starvation while completely engulfed by water is a torture that only a marooned sailor or a besieged islander can truly comprehend. Janjira miraculously possessed deep freshwater wells, a geological anomaly that had allowed the fortress to exist in the first place. But as the siege dragged on from months into years, the relentless drawing of water to sustain thousands of trapped souls, combined with the desperate need to boil leather and clean wounds, began to drain the island's lifeblood. The water table dropped to terrifyingly low levels, turning the life-giving wells into muddy, brackish puddles. The rationing of water became even more draconian than the rationing of food. Every drop was measured, every sip calculated against the unbearable heat of the coastal sun. The salty sea breeze, which had once been a refreshing embrace, now felt like a cruel mockery, drying their cracked lips and burning their parched throats. They would stand on the battlements, their throats closing up, staring at the millions of gallons of water crashing against the rocks below, knowing that to drink it would mean a rapid, agonizing death from salt poisoning. The ocean taunted them, its rhythmic waves sounding like a constant, whispering invitation to surrender to the depths. Yet they turned their backs to the mocking sea, gathering the muddy drops from their diminishing wells, filtering it through rags, and sharing it with a reverence usually reserved for the divine. In the face of this overwhelming deprivation, the very act of swallowing a thimbleful of tainted water became a sacred communion, a shared vow that they would hold the line against the empire, against the sea, and against the fading light of their own mortality. The Maratha artillery commanders, humiliated by the stubborn survival of a starving garrison, decided to unleash a tempest unlike any the coast had ever witnessed. If starvation could not break the city will, perhaps a cataclysm of fire and iron would. Day and night, the mainland batteries and the surrounding armada synchronized their bombardments, turning the airspace above Janjira into a screaming canopy of gray sulfur and flying lead. Heavy cannonballs, forged in the vast armories of the empire, struck the ancient black basalt of the fortress with earth-shattering concussions. Each impact sent violent tremors through the island's bedrock, vibrating up through the feet of the emaciated defenders. The air inside the fort grew thick with pulverized stone and the acrid stench of black powder. Shrapnel rained down on the narrow streets, tearing through the thatched roofs of the inner dwellings and shattering the stone pathways. Yet, amidst this apocalyptic storm, the moving phantoms of Janjira stood their ground. They loaded their own massive cannons, the famous Khalil Bungadeh, with arms that felt like lead, their bodies jolting violently with every recoil. The Marathas were firing at an enemy they assumed was broken, but they were met with a ferocious, targeted retaliation that defied all logic of human endurance. The physical destruction of the fort's upper parapets contrasted sharply with the unyielding architecture of the city spirit. They patched the breached walls with rubble and their own blood under the cover of darkness, ensuring that when the sun rose, the fortress looked as defiant as ever. The tempest from the cannons was meant to be the final, crushing blow, but it only served to illuminate the terrifying resolve of a people who had decided that their graves would be standing up, facing the sea, and firing back. But iron and fire were not the only threats to the island's survival. The most perilous battle was being fought in the dark, damp corridors of the human mind. The edge of collapse is not a sudden cliff one falls from. It is a steep, slippery slope of rationalized despair. As the siege stretched into an unimaginable abyss of time, the psychological torment reached a fever pitch. Whispers of surrender, once considered treasonous, began to circulate in the shadows of the rationing lines. The temptation to simply open the gates, to trade the agonizing slow death of starvation for the swift, albeit humiliating, mercy of the enemy, became an intoxicating poison. Fathers looked at their skeletal children. Mothers wept over empty pots. And seasoned warriors questioned the absolute limits of their loyalty. It is in this terrifying crucible of doubt that the true weight of leadership is tested. The Siddi commanders, carrying the immense burden of thousands of lives on their fading shoulders, had to become more than just military tech. They had to become the spiritual anchors of their people. They walked among the desperate, their own bodies as ravaged by the famine as any other, and spoke of the profound difference between a body that perishes and a soul that is conquered. They reminded their people of the chains their ancestors had broken, of the vast oceans they had crossed, and of the fundamental truth that to surrender Janjira was to erase their very existence from the tapestry of history. The commanders did not offer false hope of rescue. Instead, they offered the grim, magnificent dignity of absolute resistance. They drew a line in the bloody, pulverized stone of the courtyard and declared that the empire could have the island, but only after they had stepped over the lifeless body of every single descendant of Africa. This raw, unflinching confrontation with their own mortality purged the whispers of mutiny. The garrison stepped back from the edge of the abyss, choosing the unbearable agony of freedom over the comfortable illusion of servitude. When the flesh is stripped of all worldly comfort, when the stomach is empty and the muscles have withered to dust, the soul is laid bare before the universe. In the darkest, most agonizing hours of the Janjira siege, faith became the invisible mortar holding the shattered stones and the shattered men together. It was a spirituality forged in the crucible of ultimate suffering. As the relentless bombardment shook the island, the rhythmic chanting of prayers rose above the roar of the cannons. These were not desperate pleas for miraculous salvation. They were profound affirmations of existence. The Siddi people, deeply connected to both the Islamic traditions they had adopted and the ancestral rhythms of their African homeland, found a transcendent strength in their collective devotion. They gathered in the dim, smoke-filled chambers of the fort, their hollow eyes closed, their voices blending with the eternal crashing of the waves outside. They called upon the divine, and they called upon the spirits of their forefathers who had endured the horrors of the Middle Passage and the brutality of displacement. This spiritual communion created an ethereal fortress within the physical one. It provided a profound psychological armor that no Maratha cannonball could pierce. To the besieging army, the defiant call to prayer echoing across the bloody waters at dawn was a terrifying sound. It was the sound of a people who had detached themselves from the fear of death, who had found a meaning in their suffering that transcended the physical realm. Their faith turned the boiled leather they chewed into a sacrament of survival, and the muddy, brackish water they sipped into the nectar of immortality. They were no longer just defending a rock in the ocean. They were defending the sacred sanctuary of their own unbreakable spirit. Yet the universe harbors a profound, often cruel irony in the theater of war. The hunter, fixated entirely on the prey, frequently forgets the harshness of the wilderness. Outside the impregnable walls of Janjira, the massive Maratha war machine was beginning to undergo its own silent devastation. A siege is a two-edged sword. It starves the trapped, but it also anchors the trappers to a single, unforgiving location. As the seasons turned, the dreaded Indian monsoon arrived, transforming the coastal mainland into a swamp of disease and misery. The Maratha camps, teeming with thousands of soldiers, horses, and camp followers, became breeding grounds for dysentery, cholera, and malaria. The relentless rain turned their gunpowder to sludge and rusted their magnificent swords. Supply lines from the interior of the empire grew strained, bogged down in the endless mud. The psychological toll of besieging a fortress that simply refused to fall began to rot the morale of the Maratha infantry, that were dying not from the glorious clash of swords but from invisible fevers and the biting cold of the monsoon winds. Were commanders, once so confident in their inevitable victory, watched in horror as their grand army disintegrated before their eyes. The irony was absolute and bitter. The mighty empire, with all its vast resources and endless manpower, was being slowly bled to death by a tiny, starving garrison of African descent who had done nothing but lock their doors and refuse to die. The hunter had become the hunted, trapped by their own obsession, defeated by the sheer, unyielding stubbornness of a people who had made an alliance with eternity. Then arrived a morning that felt inexplicably, profoundly different. It was not heralded by the deafening roar of artillery, nor by the frantic ringing of alarm bells. It was heralded by a heavy, almost terrifying silence that swept across the Arabian Sea. The thick coastal fog slowly lifted, pulling back the curtain on a transformed horizon. The Siddi sentries, their eyes straining from their sunken sockets, peered through the gun ports and witnessed a sight that their exhausted minds struggled to comprehend. The Maratha armadas, that impenetrable wall of wood, sailed hostility that had choked their island for years, were turning away. On the mainland cliffs, the heavy siege cannons were being dismantled and dragged back into the mud, and they're fluttering above the retreating enemy camps. The proud flags of the Maratha Empire were being lowered in the quiet shame of a broken siege. The impossible had happened. The famine of Janjira was over. There was no wild cheering within the fortress, no explosive celebration of victory. The survivors were too weak, too close to the veil of death to muster the energy for triumph. Instead, there was a profound, weeping silence. Men and women fell to their knees on the cold stone, their tears mixing with the salt of the ocean breeze. They had not defeated the empire in a grand, sweeping battle. They had defeated it by outlasting it. They had eaten boiled leather, they had drank mud. They had watched their loved ones fade into phantoms, but they had never, ever lowered their gaze. The lowering of the Maratha flag was the ultimate validation of their suffering, as the first civilian supply ships eventually breached the horizon, bringing the unimaginable luxury of fresh grain and clean water. The sun rose on a new era. The fortress of Janjira stood scarred, battered and blackened by fire, but it remained unbroken. The Siddi warriors had achieved a victory that transcended military strategy. They had achieved immortality. They proved that while an empire can surround a people, bombard their homes, and starve their bodies, it can never conquer a spirit that has decided it is entirely, unconditionally free.